I want you to try and remember something for just a second. Try to recall the actual physical feeling of taking your very first steps. Or, try to hear the exact sound of your mother's voice on the day you first opened your eyes. You can't, right? It's a pretty chilling reality when you really stop to think about it. You lived an entire life before the age of 3. You tasted new foods, you walked, you spoke your first words, and that entire life has been completely, totally wiped clean from your mind. So today, in this explainer, we're going to dive right into that black hole where the first years of your life should be. Now, most people just assume the answer to this missing time is super simple. They think, well, I was just a baby. My brain just wasn't ready yet. It was way too weak to hold on to those memories. But actually, scratch that. That's not quite right. The reality of this missing time is actually a profound biological mystery that is far stranger and honestly a lot more unsettling than anyone really expects. Because, as it turns out, your baby brain wasn't failing to record your life. It was recording absolutely everything. This total inability to retrieve these early episodic memories, it's a phenomenon that Sigmund Freud first put a name to way back in 1905. He called it infantile amnesia. And for decades, this just stood as a locked door in the field of psychology. Because think about it, if our infant brains were actually capable of taking in the world, what exactly came along and destroyed the recordings of those early years? Well, we need to take a look at our first suspect. Section 1. The 3 missing years. Did your brain fail to record? Let's completely dismantle this really common myth that infant brains are simply incapable of storing information. Back in the 1980s, a psychologist named Carolyn Ravique Collier at Rutgers University ran this absolutely elegant experiment. On day 1, she tied a little ribbon from a baby's ankle to a mobile hanging above their crib. By day 2, these babies had quickly figured out that kicking made the mobile move, and they absolutely loved it. But the real revelation came weeks later. When she brought those exact same 2 to 6-month-old babies back, they remembered. They started kicking immediately. So even at that tiny age, infant brains can learn, they can store information, and they can reliably recall it weeks later. But flash forward to adulthood, and every single trace of those kicking experiments and literally everything else from those early years is just gone, which leaves us with this deep, almost uncomfortable emotional tension. If the baby brain was actively recording those memories, they were there, which means we have to figure out the culprit that actively stepped in and destroyed those files before you grew up. Section 2. The Engine of Memory. Anatomy of a Missing Past. To track down our culprit, we really have to look at the biological baseline. Deep inside your brain is this small, curved structure called the hippocampus. You can basically think of it as the engine of memory formation. It's the exact piece of hardware that allows you to take a lived experience, like a walk in the rain or a birthday party, and encode it as a distinct episode that you can actually replay in your mind later on. Now, in adults, this structure works seamlessly with the prefrontal cortex to tag and store these episodes. But in babies, this whole system is essentially a massive construction zone. And the absolutely crucial gateway for those new memories is a region called the dentate gyrus. But here's the catch. Because this specific region isn't fully wired until somewhere between ages 2 and 4, the connections to the cortex are completely unfinished. So your infant brain could easily form short-term memories, like exactly how to kick that mobile, but the physical wiring simply wasn't finished enough to move those memories into permanent, long-term storage. Section 3. The Cost of Growth. Building a mind, erasing a past. But incomplete wiring is really only half the story here. The rest involves a pretty shocking biological plot twist. Back in 2014, neuroscientists Sheena Jocelyn and Paul Franklin uncovered something that totally changed our understanding of memory forever. They posed this slightly unsettling hypothesis. What if the very process that builds your brain is also the exact same thing that destroys your memories? They were looking closely at a process called neurogenesis, which is basically the rapid, extraordinary production of brand new neurons in those first few years of life. Jocelyn and Franklin suspected that this explosive brain growth actually came with a really heavy cost. They tested this out on mice, and they published their astounding results in the journal Science. Basically, when they artificially increased neurogenesis in adult mice, a massive flood of new brain cells integrated into the existing circuits, and suddenly the mice started forgetting things they had previously learned. And on the flip side, when they artificially slowed neurogenesis down in infant mice, those infants suddenly held onto their memories way, way longer than normal. The biological explosion of new brain cells literally disrupted and overwrote the existing memory circuits. So, what does this actually mean for you? It means your earliest experiences weren't lost because they were weak. And they weren't lost because they were never saved in the first place. No, they were lost because your brain was relentlessly overriding them to build your future intelligence. It's like your brain kept building new rooms and it just had to tear down the old walls in the process. Section 4. The birth of you. Who is the baby in the photograph? Now, this actually builds from pure neurology into a really deep existential layer of psychology. Because to form what scientists call an autobiographical memory, you need something that we completely take for granted, a sense of self. Developmental psychologists Mark Howe and Mary Courage explored this perfectly in the late 1990s with the famous Rouge test. Here's how it works. You place a little dot of rouge, like makeup, on a baby's nose, and you sit them right in front of a mirror. Before roughly 18 months of age, a baby treats that reflection like it's another child entirely. But right after 18 months, a massive milestone is crossed. The baby reaches for the mark on their own face. They finally truly recognize their distinct existence, totally separate from the rest of the world. And wow, does this track perfectly with the dawn of early memory? The philosophical reality of infantile amnesia is that you can't remember being a baby, largely because the very concept of you simply did not exist yet. There was absolutely no narrator inside your head packaging all those raw sensory inputs into a cohesive, continuous story that belonged to someone named you. Which brings us to a really uncomfortable, incredibly thought-provoking question. If you had absolutely no continuous sense of self, and the physical brain that held those very early experiences physically rewired itself beyond recognition, literally tearing down the old walls neuron by neuron, is the baby in your old photos actually you? Or is it someone else entirely? Someone whose mind was literally disassembled and rebuilt from the ground up to make the person watching this explainer right now. Section 5. The architecture of recall. The container for the water. That haunting little thought leads us right to the final layer of this mystery, how humans actually construct lasting mental records. Developmental psychologist Catherine Nelson spent years studying this exact transition. See, before you could speak, your experiences were really just raw sensory impressions, flashes of light, textures, loud sounds, but without words, they had absolutely no framework to attach to. It's only once children start speaking and really having conversations with adults about past events that their memory improves dramatically. Her conclusion on this is just beautiful. She said, language gives memory a skeleton. Without it, experiences are like water with no container. They exist purely in the moment, and then they just slip away. And this isn't just some abstract theory either. It plays out perfectly in this fascinating cultural data from Cornell psychologist Chi Wang. In Western cultures, where parents frequently ask questions and narrate a child's experiences out loud, the earliest memory hits around 3.5 years old. But consider the Maori people of New Zealand. Their culture places this massive, extraordinary emphasis on oral traditions and really early personal storytelling. And because of that, they build that container for memories much earlier, pushing their average first memory all the way back to 2.5 years. Meanwhile, in some East Asian cultures where early childhood narratives focus a little less on the individual, that earliest memory shifts closer to age 4. So when we finally pull back and look at all the clues together, we can see exactly what happened to those earliest years of yours. It wasn't caused by one single biological failure. It was literally the perfect storm of forgetting, and it was all happening at exactly the same time. You had an underdeveloped hippocampus that couldn't form those long-term links. You had a destructive flood of new neurons literally tearing through the fragile circuits that did exist. You had a missing sense of self to anchor those lived experiences to. And finally, you had an absolute absence of language to give them a structure that could actually survive the test of time. Every single person you have ever met has this exact same black hole right where the first years of their life should be. And the reason why? It isn't a flaw at all. Your brain was just doing something far, far more important than remembering its past. It was busy building your future. Losing that early life wasn't a mistake. It was the ultimate biological sacrifice. Becoming who you are today required, quite literally, destroying the person who came before. Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on today. If your past is really just a story you've forgotten, Who are you, really? Thanks so much for joining me.